Hello, ladies and gentlemen. John O'Keefe present and accounted for. Mr. O, if you have known me in the classroom, some of you who are watching right now would call me Uncle John. Some of you who are watching would call me the funny guy who reads stories on YouTube. Some of you would call me the weirdo. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are located. I think everybody in the United States would call this good afternoon. Hello. If it is your lunchtime, sit back, relax. If it is your end of online day, sit back and relax. Hopefully you've gotten all your work taken care of. Hopefully you have achieved greatness today thus far. I don't know how the springtime is treating you, but plain and simple, you can see behind me the sun's shining, and it is a beautiful spring day. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, it is time to begin the grand adventure of chapters 3 and chapters 4. But let's do just a real quick recap. So there's this guy, old guy. He happens to see a fight amongst a bunch of dogs. He sees one being ganged up on by all of them. He sees how his strength goes into a hedge in order to protect himself, and he goes in and scares them all away and then brings this guy home. He happens to have this kind of collar on that seems to have a little bit of a makeshift scratch name in it called Buddy. Brings him home, eats, and that dog sleeps for like a day and a half. And then all of a sudden that night he looks at him and says, "You can go on wherever you're headed off to." And it's kind of weird for us. JP, one of my men in my current classroom, made a clear statement about how he couldn't believe that this guy just let this dog go and how in the world he knew that was going to happen. But all the same, he is off on a new adventure. And then all of a sudden this guy goes and sits down and looks at these trophies that are up on his fireplace and goes back into his memory. And all of a sudden we find ourselves back in time. We're doing what's called a flashback for this story. And in this flashback, he has this memory of this little tiny log cabin farm that he lives in. He's got his dad. He's got his two sisters, little sisters, of course. He's got his mama. And I think he had a cat by the name of Sammy, if I'm not mistaken. But he starts on the inside having this thing for puppies. He wants a puppy so bad. He doesn't just want one puppy. He wants two. And he doesn't just want any puppy. He wants red-bone coonhounds. So he starts having trouble sleeping. He starts having trouble eating. He's trying to help Papa on the farm. He's trying to do all these things. And then all of a sudden, he hears off in the distance during hunting season the baying of a hound. And he can't do anything but stay up all night and just listen to the hunter, listen to that dog, and listen to them doing it. So his dad finally breaks down and says, "Well, I guess I'm going to have to get him something." So what does he get him? He gets him these two steel traps. Now, I want to be really clear and make sure you understand what these traps are. These are not kind traps by any stretch of the imagination. They've got these two steel edges on the side of them. They're used as a spring, kind of like right in here. And they've got this little button here that traps. So you pull it apart, you set it, and then when an animal lands on it, it shuts on their leg. It is not a pretty thing. So, of course, the first thing that he ends up catching a whole bunch is his cat, Sammy. And after a little while, Sammy gets a little bit frustrated, and he heads off into the mountains and becomes kind of a homeless cat. Stops by every once in a while, but never gives our main character, Billy, a second thought. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, one of the things that I want you to remember as we begin is get something in your hand. Get a piece of paper, get a journal, get something that you can like draw pictures with. Something that you can maybe jot little notes down about what you're hearing in this part of the story. Label it Chapter 3. Start with Chapter 3. And hopefully it's on the same page or another page that's connected to the other pages from chapters 1 and 2. And then what you're going to see is as we go through this story, you're going to have this whole really cool opportunity to kind of follow along. There are a couple other people out there I got to give props to because I've gotten the thumbs up regarding it. There are some others who don't want to do that whole drawn thing. They don't want to do that part, but they've got the book Where the Red Fern Grows by Wilson Rawls right in front of them. Riley, you know who you are. And you're sitting there, and maybe your brother has one too. You're sitting there and you've got the words right in front of you, and so you're reading that along. If all you want to do is sit back and relax and listen to the story, find a comfortable place to do that with. And then, more importantly, sit back and don't let anything else get in the way of this storytelling. Give this 30 to 35 minutes of your life strictly to the beauty of a good writer and how that good writer brings that story to life for you. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let us bring forth the story itself. I have my book on order, but of course, I'm waiting for them to finally deliver it. So pay close attention. I'm going to be reading on an online piece so that you can enjoy the beautiful day that you have before you. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Chapter 3 of Where the Red Fern Grows by Wilson Rawls. The dog-wanton disease never did leave me altogether. With the new work I was doing, helping Papa that is, it just kind of burned itself down and left a big sore on my heart. Every time I'd see a coon tracked down in the fields or along the riverbanks, the old sore would just get all festered up and start hurting again. Festered up and hurting again. Let's talk about that. You ever have a sore or you ever have a cut that you keep picking at and it keeps bleeding and it keeps coming back, keeps coming back, keeps coming back? Well, that's kind of what his dog-wanting disease was all about. It just kept coming back. It didn't ever get better. It just kept going. Sometimes it'd go away, sometimes it would come back. Just when I had given up all hope of ever owning a good hound, something wonderful happened. The good Lord figured I had heard enough, and it was time to lend a helping hand. Sounds like something's changing. Something's coming right now, so pay close attention. It all started one day while I was hoeing corn down in our field close down by the river. Across that river, a party of fishermen had been camped for several days. I heard the old Maxwell car as it snorted and chugged its way out of the bottoms. I knew that they were leaving. Throwing down my hoe, I ran out of the bottoms. I ran down to the river and waded across at a place called Shannon Ford. I hurried to the campground. Stop. Pause for just a quick moment. Shannon Ford, capital F-O-R-D. This is not the car. A ford down here in the south, that is a place in which you can cross the river. It has a tendency to have some rocks, a rapid, something that is a little bit more shallow, usually causes a little bit of a ripple, but it is a place in which you can get across the river without getting swept away by it. So he has come across a place called Shannon Ford. So he's crossing from his side to the other side of the river. I hurried to their campground. It was always a pleasure to prowl where fishermen had camped. I usually could find things, a fish line or a forgotten fish pole. On one occasion, I found a beautiful knife stuck in the bark of a sycamore tree, forgotten by some careless fisherman. But on this day, on this particular day, I found the greatest of all treasures, a sportsman's magazine I discarded by the campers who just left. It was a real treasure for a country boy because that magazine, my entire life was changed. Perk up your ears because something's happening. I sat down on an old sycamore log and I started thumbing through the leaves. On the back pages of that magazine, I came to the for sale section. Dogs for sale, every kind of dog. I read on and on. They had dogs I had never heard of, names I couldn't make out. Far down on the right-hand corner, in the very bottom, I found an ad that took my breath away. In small letters, it read, "Registered red bone coon hound pups, $25 each." The advertisement was from a kennel up in Kentucky. I read it over and over. By the time I had memorized the ad, I was seeing dogs. I was hearing dogs and even feeling dogs. The magazine was forgotten. I was lost in thought. The brain of an 11-year-old boy can dream some mighty fantastic dreams. How wonderful it would be if I could have 2 of those pups. Every boy in the country but me had a good hound or 2. But $50. How could I ever get $50? I knew I couldn't expect help from Mama and Papa. I remembered a passage from the Bible my mother used to read to us. God helps those who help themselves. I thought of those words. I mulled them over and over and over and over in my mind, and I decided to ask God to help me. There, right there on the banks of the Illinois River in the cool shade of the tall white sycamores, I asked God to help me get 2 hound pups. It wasn't much of a prayer, but it did come right from the heart. When I left the campground of the fishermen, it was late. As I walked along, I could feel the hard bulge of the magazine jammed deep into the pockets of my overalls. The beautiful silence that followed the setting sun had settled over the river bottoms. The coolness of the rich black soil felt good to my bare feet. This guy's been running around with bare feet. I like that kind of guy. It was the time of day when all furry things begin to come to life. A big swamp rabbit hopped out onto the trail, sat on his haunches, stared at me, and then scampered away. A mother gray squirrel ran out on a limb of a bur oak tree. She barked a warning to the 4 furry balls behind her. They melted from sight in the thick green. A silent gray shadow drifted down from the top of the tall sycamore. There was a squeal and a beating of wings. I heard a tinkle of a bell in the distance ahead. I knew that must be Daisy, our milk cow. I'd have to start her on the way home. I get it. Daisy's out in the field, probably eating a whole bunch of grass. So he's going to have to start her getting back to the barn so she's safe throughout the evening. I took the magazine from my pocket, and again I read that ad. Slowly, a plan began to form. I'd save that money. I could sell stuff to the fishermen, crawfish, minnows, and fresh vegetables. In berry season, I could sell all the berries I could pick at my grandfather's store. I could trap in the winter. The more I planned, the more real my plan became. There was the way to get those pups. Save my money. Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen who are out there working, who are out there in school, if you have a dream, I am going to tell you, not every dream gets to come true. But I'm telling you, you see an ad like this for 2 hound pups that you want so badly, and you say, how can I do it? There's almost always a way. And if you can't figure it out, go and help. Go ask for help. Go figure it out. Okay, so anyway, right now, there was something more important. Those $50, a fabulous son, a fortune far more money than I had ever seen in my whole life. Somehow, some way, I was determined to get it. I had 23 cents, a dime I had earned during running errands for my grandpa, and 13 cents a fisherman had given me for a can of worms. 23 cents. He needs $50. Mathematicians, go figure it out. The next morning, I went to the trash pile behind the barn. I was looking for a can-me bank. I picked up several, but they didn't seem to be what I wanted. Then I saw it. An old Casey baking powder can. It was perfect, long and slender with a good tight lid. I took it down to the creek and scrubbed it with sand until it was bright and new looking. Sorry, I had to look this up for a second, and I wanted to make sure that I shared it with you. I looked up what a KC baking powder can looked like because I'm not very good at knowing what those are. Now, I'm hoping you're going to be able to see it through all that stuff, but do you see the old KC can? This is real. This is a real deal thing. This is from olden days. I think the baking powder inside it probably would be pretty bad right now, but the reality is that a KC baking powder can is tin, and it's got a good lid on the top of it. So it's going to be something that he's going to be able to keep all the money that he wants to in it. All right, so let's get going again. I dropped the 23 cents that I had into that can, the coins looking so small lying there on the shiny bottom of it. But to me, it was a start. With my finger, I tried to measure how full I believed it would be with $50 in it. Next, I went out to the barn and up into the loft. Far back over the hay and up under the eaves, I hid that can. I had to start toward making my dreams come true. 23 cents. I had a good bank, safe from the rats and from the rain and the snow. And now I was on my way. All through that summer, I worked like a beaver. In the small creek that wormed its way down through our fields, I caught crawfish with my bare hands. I trapped minnows with an old screen wire trap I made myself, baited with yellow cornbread from my mother's kitchen. These were sold to the fishermen along with fresh vegetables and roasting ears. I tore my way through the blackberry patches until my hands and feet were scratched raw and red from the thorns. I tramped the hills seeking out the huckleberry bushes. My father paid me 10 cents a bucket for my berries. Once Grandpa asked me what I did with the money I earned. I told him I was saving it to buy some hunting dogs. I asked him if he would order them for me when I finally had saved enough. He said he would. I asked him not to say anything to my father. He promised me he wouldn't. I'm sure Grandpa paid little attention to my plans. That winter, I trapped harder than ever with those 3 little traps that I owned. Grandpa sold my hides to fur buyers who came to his store all throughout the fur season. Prices were cheap. 15 cents for a large possum hide, 25 for a good skunk hide. Little by little, the nickels and dimes began to add up. The old KC baking powder can grew heavy. I would heft its weight in the palm of my hand with a straw I'd measure from the lip of the can down to the money. As the months went by, the straws grew shorter and shorter. Do you see how the author has given us this thing with the can growing in money and the straws getting shorter and shorter? He's getting closer to his dream. How long has it taken? I think it's taken summer, fall, and winter by this point. Listen to this moment. The next summer, I followed the same routine. This boy has been doing it for over a year right now. Does he want these dogs? Oh, yes, he does. Would you like to buy some crawfish or minnows? Maybe you'd like some fresh vegetables or roasting ears. That's what I would say when I show up. The fishermen were wonderful, as true sportsmen often are. They seemed to sense the urgency in my voice and always bought my wares. However, many was the time I'd find my vegetables left in the abandoned camp. There never was a set price. Anything they offered was good enough for me. A year passed. I was 12 years old. I was over the halfway mark. I had $27.46. My spirits soared. I worked harder. Another year crawled slowly by, and then the great day came. The long, hard grind was over. I had it. $50. I cried as I counted it over and over again. As I set the can back in the shadowy eaves of the barn, it seemed to glow with a radiant whiteness I had never seen before. Perhaps it was all imagination. I don't know. Lying back in the soft hay of that barn, I folded my hands behind my head, closed my eyes, and let my mind wander back over the 2 long years that had just happened. I thought of the fishermen, the blackberry patches, and the huckleberry hills. I thought of the prayer I had said to God when I asked him to get me 2 hound pups. I knew he had surely helped, for he had given me the heart, the courage, and the determination. Early the next morning, with the can jammed deep into the pocket of my overalls, I flew to my grandpa's store. As I trotted along, I whistled and I sang. I felt as big as the tallest mountains in the Ozarks. Arriving at my destination, I saw 2 wagons were tied up at the hitching rack. I knew some farmers had come to the store, so I waited until they left. As I walked in, I saw my grandfather behind the counter, tugging and pulling. I worked the can out of my pocket and dumped it out in front of him and looked up. Grandpa was dumbfounded. He tried to say something, but it wouldn't come out. He looked at me, and he looked at the pile of coins. Finally, in a voice much louder than he ordinarily used, he asked, "Where did you get all this, boy?" "I told you, Grandpa," I said. "I was saving my money so I could buy 2 hound pups. I did. You said you would order them for me. I've got the money, and now I want you to order them for me." Grandpa stared at me over his glasses and then back at the money. "How long you been saving this?" he asked. "A long time, Grandpa," I said. "How long?" he asked. I told him. 2 years. His mouth flew open in a loud voice. He said, 2 years! I nodded my head. The way my grandfather stared at me made me uneasy. I was on needles and pins. Taking his eye from me, he glanced back at the money. He saw the faded yellow pieces of paper sticking out from the coins. He worked it out, asking as he did, "What's this?" I told him it was the ad, telling where to order my dogs. He read it, turned it over, and glanced at the other side. I saw the astonishment leave his eyes, and the friendly old grandfather look finally came back. I finally felt much better. Dropping the paper back on the money, he turned, picked up an old turkey feather duster, and started dusting where there was no dust. He kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye as he walked slowly down the other side of the store, dusting here, dusting there, turning back, dusting here, dusting there, turning back. He put the duster down, came from behind that counter and walked up to me, laying a friendly old work-calloused hand on my head. He changed the conversation altogether, saying, "Son, you need a haircut." I told him I didn't mind. I didn't like my hair short. Flies and mosquitoes bothered me. He glanced down at my bare feet and asked, "How come your feet are cut and scratched all up like that?" I told him it was pretty tough picking blackberries barefoot. He nodded his head. It was too much for my grandfather. He turned and walked away. I saw the glasses come off and the old red handkerchief come out. I heard the good excuse of blowing his nose. He stood for several seconds with his back toward me. When he turned around, I noticed his eyes were moist. Pause for just a minute. To my readers, to my writers, I want to tell you, as you begin to try to tell your story, take a look at how this author drew the picture of Grandpa crying before he ever said anything about it. Check this out. It was too much for my grandfather. He turned and walked away. I saw the glasses come off and the old red handkerchief come on out. I heard the good excuse of blowing his nose. He stood for several seconds with his back toward me. When he turned around, I noticed his eyes were moist. Hear it? This man's been crying. He never said he was crying. He gave us all the pictures of what we needed to hear. In a quavering voice, he said, "Well, son, it's your money. You worked for it, and you worked hard. You got it honestly, and you want some dogs. We're going to get those dogs. Be damned, be damned." Some of you might think that I just swore. And I want to be real careful with this because I might have some parents out there listening too. I want you to hear that sometimes an author is going to use words that are what we would call swear words, inappropriate to be saying to our friends. And I still agree with that. But what is he saying right here? He is promising him. He says, you've earned this money honestly. You have worked hard. You have shown determination and a willingness to do whatever it takes. And so what he's saying is he is saying, by goodness, this is going to happen. This is going to happen. I have a feeling that Grandpa's having a little bit of a problem with the idea of letting this happen without Mama and Daddy knowing. Because remember, Billy did ask to keep it a secret. So anyway, that was as near as I ever came to hearing my grandfather curse, if you can call it cursing. He walked over and he picked up the ad again, asking, "Is this ad 2 years old too?" I nodded. "Well," he said, "first thing we have to do is write this outfit. There may not be even a place like this in Kentucky anymore. After all, a lot of things can happen in 2 years. Seeing that I was a little worried, he said, "Now you go on home. I'll write these kennels and I'll let you know when I get an answer. If we can't get the dogs there, we can get them someplace else. And I don't think, if I were you, I would let my papa know anything about this right now. I happen to know he wants to buy that red mule from old man Potter." I told him I wouldn't, and turned to leave the store. As I reached the door, my grandfather said in a very loud voice, "Say, it's been a long time since you've had any candy, hasn't it?" I nodded my head. He asked, "How long?" I told him, "A long time, sir." "Well," he said, "we'll have to do something about that." Walking over behind the counter, he reached out and got a sack. I noticed it wasn't one of the nickel sacks. It was one of the quarter kind of sacks. My eyes never left my grandfather's hand. Time after time, it dipped in and out of the candy counter. Peppermint sticks, jawbreakers, whorehounds, and gumdrops. The sack bulged. So did my eyes. Handing the sack to me, he said, "Here. First big coon you catch with those dogs, you can pay me back for it." I told him I promised I would. On my way home with a jawbreaker in one side of my mouth and a piece of whorehound in the other, I skipped and I hopped, making half an effort to try to whistle and sing, and couldn't because of the candy. I had the finest grandpa in the whole wide world, and I was the happiest boy in the whole world. I wanted to share my happiness with my sisters, but decided not to say anything about ordering the pups. Arriving home, I dumped the entire sack of candy out on the bed. 6 little hands helped themselves. I was well repaid by the love and adoration I saw in the wide blue eyes of my 3 little sisters. What? 3 little sisters? I thought there were only 2. See, sometimes when you're reading, you get corrected. 3 little sisters. Thank you, Mr. Rawls, for saying that again, because I was picturing a smaller family than you had created. Chapter 4. Now, before we start Chapter 4, have some of the things earlier in the book started to be answered? For sure. That whole chapter was all about what? I'll give you a second. That's right. The entire chapter was about how hard Billy had to work in order to raise the money to get those coonhounds. Did he ever give up? Did he stop? Did he get bored and get distracted and start wanting to play Fortnite? Ha! I'm just kidding. There wasn't such thing as Fortnite back then. But what I want to say is he kept his mind and his spirits up, and he problem solved. Chapter 4. Day after day, I would fly to that store. Grandpa would shake his head. Then, on a Monday, as I entered the store, I sensed a change in my grandfather. He was in high spirits, talking and laughing with 6 farmers. Every time I caught his eye, he would smile and wink at me. I thought the farmers would never leave, but finally, the store was empty. Grandpa told me the letter had come. The kennels were still there, and they had dogs for sale. He said that he had made the mail buggy wait until he made out the order. And another thing, the dog market had gone downhill. The price of a dog had dropped $5. He handed me a $10 bill. Now, there's still one stump in your way, he said. The mail buggy cannot carry things like dogs, so they'll come as far as the depot in Tulaqua. But you'll get the notice here because I ordered them in your name. I thanked my grandfather with all my heart and asked him how long I'd have to wait for the notice. He said, I don't know, but it shouldn't take more than a couple weeks. I asked how I was going to get my dogs from Tulaqua. Well, there's always someone going into Tulaqua, he said, and you could ride in with them. That evening, the silence of our supper was interrupted when I asked my father this question. Papa, how far is it to Kentucky? I may as well have exploded a bomb. For an instant, there was complete silence, and then my oldest sister giggled. The 2 little ones stared at me. With a half-hearted laugh, my father said, Well now, I don't know, but it's a pretty good ways. What do you want to know for? Thinking of taking the trip to Kentucky? No, I said. I was just wondering. My youngest sister giggled and asked, Can I go with you? I glared at her. Mama broke into the conversation. I declare, what kind of question is that? How far is it to Kentucky? I don't know. What's gotten into that mind of yours lately, son? You go around like you were lost and you're losing weight. You're as skinny as a rail, and look at that hair. Just last Sunday, they had a hair cutting over at Tom Holland's place, but you couldn't go. You had to go prowling around the rivers and the woods. I told Mama that I'd get a haircut next time they had a cutting. And I just heard some fellows talking about Kentucky up at the store and wondered how far away it was. Much to my relief, the conversation was ended. The days dragged by. A week passed and still no word about my dogs. Terrible thoughts ran through my mind. Maybe my dogs were lost. The train had a wreck. Someone stole my money. Or perhaps the mailman lost my order. Then, at the end of the 2nd week, the notice came. What if I were to stop right now? No! I'm just kidding. I wouldn't stop right now. But do you see how this writer is giving you something to hold on to right now? Here we go. The notice came. My grandfather told me that he had talked to Jim Hodges that day. He was going into town in about a week, and I could ride in with him to pick up my dogs. Again, I thanked my grandfather. I started for home, walking along in deep thought. I decided it was time to tell my father the entire story. I fully intended to tell him that evening. I tried several times, but somehow I couldn't. I wasn't scared of him, for he never whipped me. He was always kind and gentle. But for some reason, I don't know why, I just couldn't tell him. So I need to stop for just a quick moment and ask about what you've just learned about Pa. First, what did you learn about his character? Does he treat Billy roughly? Does he spank him? Does he scold him very often? I believe it said, I wasn't scared of him, for he never whipped me. He was always kind and gentle. But for some reason, Billy just couldn't figure out how to tell him. So now I'm going to ask you, why? Why couldn't Billy tell him? That's always an interesting question. I'm just wondering as a reader. That night, snuggled deep into the soft folds of a feather bed, I lay thinking. I had waited so long for my dogs, and I so desperately wanted to see them and hold them. I didn't want to wait a whole week for a ride into town. In a flash, I made up my mind. Very quietly, I got up, and I put on my clothes. I sneaked into the kitchen and got one of Mama's precious flour sacks. In it, I put 6 eggs, some leftover cornbread, a little salt, and a few matches. Next, I went to the smokehouse and cut off a piece of salt pork. I stopped at the barn and picked up a gunny sack. I put the flour sack inside the gunny sack. This I rolled up and I crammed lengthwise into the bib of my overalls. I was on my way. I was going after my dogs. Tahlequah was a small country town with a population of about 800 people. By the road, it was 32 miles away. But as the crow flies, it was only 20 miles. I went as the crow flies straight through the hills. I got to stop for a real quick second. So you remember, he's living in the Ozarks. So he's got all these mountains around him. He's in a little tiny cabin somewhere out in the middle of those Ozarks where her family or his mama's family gave him some land so his father could make a farm. And so if he takes the road, that road doesn't go up and over mountains. That road goes around mountains, and it goes through little valleys, and it goes around other mountains, and then it finally gets to Tahlequah. But what he's going to do is he's going to take his walk from his house, and he's going to go as the crows fly. Now, crows don't need any roads. They fly over things. So what he's going to do is he's going to go from here, and he's going to go up over the mountain, and he's going to come down the mountain. He's going to go through the valley. He's going to go up over mountains again, and he's going to come down and come into Tahlequah. But as the crow flies means he doesn't have a trail. Instead of going 32 miles on a road, he's going to go 20 miles as the crow flies. Got that? Okay. So, although I had never been to town in my entire life, I knew what direction to take. Tahlequah and Dye Railroad lay on the other side of the river from our place. I had the Frisco Railroad on my right and the Illinois River on my left. Not far from where the railroad crossed the river lay the town of Tahlequah. I knew if I bore to the right, I would find the railroad, and if I bore to the left, I had the river to guide me, both of which would lead me to Tahlequah. Sometime that night, I crossed the river on a riffle somewhere in the Dripping Springs country. Coming out of the river bottoms, I scattered up along a log hogback ridge and broke out on top in the flats. In a mile-eaten trot, I moved along. Ooh, that's interesting. In a mile-eating trot. So a trot, if any of you are horse lovers, a trot is kind of somewhere in between a walk and a gallop. So he's trotting. And how long does he go? A mile-eating trot. So that means he's moving at a pretty good pace. In a mile-eating trot, I moved along. I had the wind of a deer, the muscles of a country boy, a heart full of dog love, and a strong determination. I wasn't scared of the dark or the mountains, for I was raised in these mountains. I knew these mountains. On, mile after mile, I moved along. I saw faint gray streaks appear in the east. I knew daylight was close. My bare feet were getting sore from the flint rocks and sawbriars. I stopped beside a mountain stream, soaked my feet in the cool water, rested for a spell, and then started on again. After leaving the mountain stream, my pace was much slower. The muscles in my legs were beginning to get stiff. Feeling the pangs of hunger gnawing at my stomach, I decided it was time to stop and eat at the next stream I found. Then I remembered I had forgotten to include a can in which to boil my eggs. I stopped and built a small fire, cutting off a nice thick slab of salt pork. I roasted it with a piece of cold cornbread made a sandwich. Putting out my fire, I was on my way again. I ate as I trotted along, and I felt much better. Belly full, ready to roll. I was scared of Talakwa, though, and the people. Sorry, I skipped a line. I came into Talakwa from the northeast. At the outskirts of town, I hid my flour sack and provisions. Keeping the gunny sack, I walked into town. I was scared of Talakwa and the people. I had never seen such a big town and so many people walking around. There was a store after store after store. Some of them were 2 stories high. The wagon yard had wagons on top of wagons, teams, buggies, and horses. 2 young ladies about my age stopped. They stared at me and then they giggled. My blood boiled, but I could understand. After all, I had 3 sisters. They couldn't help it because they were women folk. I went on. Listen to him. Listen to that old school way of thinking. He's thinking just because they're girls, they're giggling, and so he moved on. But he's feeling pretty manly right now, and so they were women folk, and I went on. I saw a big man coming up the street. A bright, shiny star was sitting on his vest. Looked as big as a bucket. I saw the long black gun at his side, and I froze in my tracks. I'd heard of sheriffs and marshals, but I had never seen one. Stories repeated about them in the mountains told how fast they were with a gun and how many men they had killed. Then, the closer he came, the more frightened I became. I knew it was the end for me. I could just see him aiming his big black gun and shoot me between the eyes. It seemed like a miracle that he passed by, hardly glancing at me, breathing a sigh. I walked on, seeing the wonders of town. Passing a large store window, I stopped and I stared. In that window was, oh my gosh, sorry. There in the window was the most wonderful sight I had ever seen. Everything under the sun, overalls, jackets, bolts of beautiful cloth, new harnesses, collars, bridles, and then my eyes did pop open. There were several guns, and one of them had 2 barrels. I couldn't believe it, 2 barrels. I had seen several guns, but never one with 2 barrels before. Then I saw something else. The sun was just right, and the plate glass was a perfect mirror. I saw the full reflection of myself for the very first time in my entire life. Now, hold on. In a world of selfies, in a world of taking pictures of ourselves, in a world where most of our bathrooms at least have a mirror in them and probably a bedroom or 2, it's a little weird that this guy is 12 or 13 years old and he's never seen a reflection of himself. I guess the only water that was close by was what, a river? So that was rippling, so he didn't even really have that. Either that or he wasn't paying attention very well. But that's an interesting concept. I can definitely infer that he doesn't even have a single mirror in his entire house. That's amazing. This is the first time he's ever seen himself like other people see him. Next time you stand in front of the mirror, pay attention to that. You've known yourself for a very long time. This is the first time Billy's ever seen it. I could see that I did look a little odd. My straw-colored hair was long and shaggy, and it was bushed out like a corn tassel that had been hit by wind. I tried to smooth it down with my hands. This helped some, but not very much. What it needed was a good combing, and I had no comb. My overalls were patched and faded, but they were clean. My shirt had pulled out, and I tucked it back in so I was presentable. I took one look at my bare feet and winced. They were as brown as dead sycamore leaves. The spiderweb pattern of raw red scratches looked odd in the saddle brown skin. I thought, well, I won't have to pick any more blackberries and the scratches will soon go away. I pumped up one of my arms and thought surely the muscle was going to pop right through my thin blue shirt. I stuck out my tongue. It was as red as pokeberry juice, and anything that color was supposed to be healthy. After making a few faces at myself, I put my thumbs in my ears and was making mule ears when 2 old women came by. They stopped and stared at me. I stared back, and they turned to go on their way. I heard one of them say something to the other. The words were hard to catch, but I think I did hear one word, wild. As I said before, they couldn't help it. They were women folk. As I turned to leave, my eyes again fell on the overalls and the bolts of cloth. I thought my mother, father, and sisters. And here was an opportunity to make amends for leaving home without telling anyone. I entered the store. I bought a pair of overalls for Papa, and telling the storekeeper how big my mother and sisters were, I bought several yards of cloth. I also bought a sack of candy. Glancing down at my bare feet, the storekeeper said, "I've got some good shoes." I told him I didn't need any shoes. He asked if that would be all. I nodded. He added up the bill. I handed him my $10. He gave me my change. After wrapping up the bundles, he helped me put them in my sack. Lifting it to my shoulder, I turned and left the store. Out on the street, I picked out a friendly-looking old man and asked him where the depot was. He told me to go down to the last street and turn right as far as I could, and I couldn't miss it. I thanked him, and I started on my way. Leaving the main part of town, I started up a long street through the residential section. I had never seen so many beautiful homes, and they were all different colors. The lawns were neat and clean and looked like green carpets. I saw a man pushing some kind of mowing machine. I stopped to watch a whirling blades. He gawked at me. I hurried on. I heard a lot of shouting and laughing ahead of me. Not wanting to miss anything, I walked a little faster. I saw what was making the noise. More kids than I had ever seen were playing around a big red brick building. I thought some rich man lived there and was giving a party for the children. Walking up to the edge of the playground, I stopped to watch. The boys and girls were about my age and were as thick as flies around a sorghum mill. They were milling, running, and jumping. Teeter-totters and swings were loaded down with them. Everyone was laughing and having a big old time. Over against the building, a large blue pipe ran up on an angle from the ground. A few feet from the top, there was a bend in it. The pipe seemed to go into the building. Boys were crawling into its dark mouth. I counted 9 or 10 of them. One boy stood about 6 feet from the opening with a stick in his hand, staring goggle-eyed, trying to figure out what they were doing. I got a surprise. Out of the hollow pipe spurted a boy. He sailed through the air and lit right on his feet. The boy with the stick marked the ground where he had landed. All 9 of them came shooting out, one behind the other. As each boy landed, a new mark was scratched. Pause. A big red brick building with a whole bunch of kids playing around it with teeter-totters and something that sounds kind of like a slide. Yeah, I think we might be at a schoolhouse. He's never seen one of those. He's been growing up in a farm. They ganged around looking at the lines. There was a lot of loud talking, pointing, and arguing. Then all the lines were erased and a new scorekeeper was picked out. The others crawled back up the pipe. I figured how the game was played. After climbing to the top of the slide, the boys turned around and sat down. One at a time, they came flying down and out, feet first. The one that shot out the furthest was the winner. I thought how wonderful it would be if I could slide down just once. One boy, spying me standing on the corner, came over, looking me up and down. He asked, "You go to school here?" I said, "School?" He said, "Sure, school. What'd you think it was?" "Oh, no, I don't go to school here." "Do you go to Jefferson?" "No, I don't go there either." "Don't you go to school at all?" "Sure, I go to school." "Where?" "At home." "You go to school at home?" I nodded. "What grade are you in?" I said I wasn't in any grade. Puzzled, he said, "You go to school at home and don't know what grade you're in. Who teaches you?" "My mother." "What does she teach you?" I said, "Reading, writing, and arithmetic. I bet I'm just as good at it as you are." He asked, "Don't you have any shoes?" I said, "Sure, I have shoes." "Why aren't you wearing them then?" "I don't wear shoes until it gets cold." He laughed and asked where I lived. I said, "Back up in the hills." He said, "Oh, you're a hillbilly." He ran back to the mob. I saw him pointing back at me and talking to several boys. They started my way yelling, "Hillbilly, hillbilly, hillbilly, hillbilly." Just before they reached me, a bell started ringing. Turning, they ran into the front of the building, lined up into 2 long lines, and marched like little tin soldiers disappearing inside the school. The playground was completely silent. I was all alone. I started feeling a little lonely, a little sad. I heard a noise on my right. Didn't have to turn around to recognize what it was. Someone was using a hoe. I didn't know that sound. I'd know that sound if I heard it on a dark night. It was a little old white-headed woman working in a flower bed. Looking again at the long blue pipe, I thought, there's no one around. Maybe I could have one slide anyway. I eased over and looked up into the dark hollow. It looked scary, but I thought of all the other boys I had seen crawl into it. I could see the last mark on the ground and thought, I can beat that. Laying my sack down, I started climbing up. The farther I went, the darker and more scary it got. Just as I reached the very top, my feet slipped. Down I sailed, and all the way down I tried to grab onto something, but there was nothing to grab. I'm sure some great champions had slid out of that pipe, and no doubt more than one world record had been broken. But if someone had been there when I finally came out, I know the record I set would stand today in all its glory. I came out just like I went in. Feet first and belly down. My legs were spread out like a bean shooter stalk. Arms flailing in the air, I zoomed out and up. I seemed to hang suspended in the air at the peak of my climb. I could see the hard-packed ground from below. As I started down, I shut my eyes tight and gripped my teeth because I knew it was going to hurt. This didn't seem to help. With a splattering sound, I landed. I felt the air whoosh out between my teeth. I tried to scream, but had no wind left to make a sound. After bouncing a couple of times, I finally settled down to earth. I lay spread eagle for a few seconds and then slowly got to my knees. Hearing loud laughter, I looked around. It was that little old lady with the hoe in her hand. She hollered and asked how I liked it. Without answering, I grabbed up my gunny sack and left. Far up the street, I looked back. The little old lady was sitting down, rocking with laughter. I couldn't understand these town people. If they weren't staring at a fellow, they were laughing at him. And that is the end of chapter 4. What an absolutely beautiful story. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for being here. I want to thank you for the gift that you gave me. I'm going to tell you that I am not going to hand you how long it's been, but it's been about 35 years since I heard this story for the first time. I've read it a couple times since then, but I'll tell you, I will never forget all of what I experienced that first time I ever went through it. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a long session. 2 chapters is taken about 45 minutes. So I hope you can make that time. I hope that you can join us. I hope that you can be with us every day. Remember, it's going to be 3:30 every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And we're going to do an 11 o'clock Eastern time reading on Fridays. That means 10 o'clock for my Minnesota kids. That means 8 a.m. for my West Coast kids. I got to represent the O'Keefe family. I know that I've got family out there listening and paying attention. I've got friends up in Wisconsin. I've got friends out in the Northwest. I can't thank you enough for being here. It's good to be a participant in your life. Please, from right now until the end of your day, have an adventure. Go out and find something. Go get barefoot. Go play. Most importantly, have fun and come back tomorrow. I love you. Now get out of here. Have a good day.